Welcome to a collection of hauntingly real experiences that will send chills down your spine. These are not fabricated stories or figments of imagination. They are true accounts of encounters with the paranormal, the unexplained, and the downright terrifying. From eerie whispers in the dead of night to shadowy figures that vanish without a trace, these tales will immerse you in a world of unrelenting fear and mystery. Dare to step into the unknown with us. And if you're captivated by the spine-chilling and the bizarre, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unsettling stories. The shadows have secrets, and we're here to uncover them. When we bought our current house, my daughter was 5 years old. Moving into a new place was exciting, but it also came with its adjustments. In our previous house, my daughter had a peculiar habit. Whenever she woke up in the middle of the night, she'd quietly sneak into her bedroom, build a small pile of her blankets and pillows on the floor, and fall asleep in what she called her nest. We'd often wake up to find her curled up in her little cocoon, sleeping soundly. It was her way of finding comfort. In the new house, things changed. At first, everything seemed normal. My daughter's laughter filled the rooms, and she seemed to love her new space. But soon, her habit of building nests returned, only this time she was building them in her own room. She'd carefully arrange her blankets and pillows on the floor before going to sleep. Yet every morning, without fail, we'd find her in her bed, and the nest would be empty. When we asked her about it, her response was simple and unsettling. "The nest is for my friend, Rose," she said matter-of-factly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. At first, we thought nothing of it. After all, she'd had an imaginary friend named Dee in the past. Imaginary friends were a part of childhood, a harmless way for kids to express their creativity. But there was something different about Rose. Unlike Dee, who was playful and cheerful, Rose seemed quieter. My daughter would talk about her in hushed tones, almost reverently. She claimed Rose would wake her up at night, asking for a place to rest. My daughter would then get up, build the nest on the floor, and go back to bed. She spoke of this routine as if it were entirely normal. One night, I decided to investigate. After tucking my daughter into bed and making sure she was asleep, I positioned myself in the hallway outside her room. The house was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. Hours passed, and just as I was beginning to doze off, I heard it, the faint rustling of blankets. Peeking through the slightly open door, I saw my daughter sitting up in bed. Her head was tilted as if she were listening to someone speak, though the room was empty. I watched as she got out of bed and began arranging her blankets and pillows on the floor with deliberate care. She whispered something I couldn't make out and then climbed back into bed. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. I stayed there for a while longer, but nothing else happened. The next morning, I asked her about the nest again. "Did Rose use the nest last night?" I asked casually, trying not to alarm her. She nodded. Yes. She was very tired. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something about the way she said it was unnerving. It wasn't playful or imaginative, it was serious, as though she were recounting a real event. Weeks turned into months, and the routine continued. Every night, my daughter would build the nest, and every morning, she'd wake up in her bed while the nest remained untouched. My husband and I began noticing other oddities around the house. Objects would move on their own. A chair that had been pushed under the table would be pulled out, or a picture frame would tilt at an odd angle. Once, I found my daughter's favorite stuffed animal in the kitchen, even though I'd seen her tuck it under her arm before bed. The most unsettling incident happened late one night. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, when I heard footsteps in the hallway. Assuming it was my daughter, I got up to check. But when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. The footsteps continued, though, soft and deliberate, moving toward my daughter's room. I followed them, my heart pounding. When I reached her door, the footsteps stopped. The room was dark except for the faint glow of her nightlight. She was fast asleep, her chest rising and falling with each breath. And yet, the air felt cold, unnaturally so. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. One day, while cleaning out the attic, I stumbled upon an old box of photographs and documents left behind by the previous owners. Among the faded pictures was a black and white photo of a young woman standing in front of the house. She was dressed in a simple dress, her hair pinned up neatly. On the back of the photo, someone had written Rose, 1912. My heart skipped a beat. Could this be the Rose my daughter had been talking about? The name was too much of a coincidence. I showed the photo to my daughter, curious to see her reaction. Her eyes lit up, and she pointed excitedly. That's Rose. That's my friend. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. How could she have known? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she had seen the photo before without realizing it. Maybe she overheard something I hadn't noticed. But deep down, I knew there was no logical explanation. Curious and increasingly uneasy, I decided to ask our neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, about the history of the house. She was an elderly woman who had lived in the area her entire life and was known for her encyclopedic knowledge of the neighborhood. When I mentioned the name Rose, her expression softened. "Ah, Rose," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "She was the first wife of the man who built your house. Poor thing died so young. Sepsis poisoning, I believe. She passed away in the house. Such a tragedy." I felt the blood drain from my face. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was one I didn't want to see. Was it possible that the spirit of this woman was lingering in our home? And why was she drawn to my daughter? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to every creak and groan of the house. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, the soft rustling of blankets coming from my daughter's room. My curiosity got the better of me, and I quietly made my way to her door. Peeking inside, I saw her sitting up in bed, her gaze fixed on the empty space beside her. She was whispering, her voice soft and soothing, as if comforting someone. "Rose is sad tonight," she told me the next morning. "She misses her home." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't the imagination of a 5-year-old. There was something more, something we couldn't see but could definitely feel. Over time, the activity in the house grew more pronounced. Lights would flicker, doors would creak open on their own, and cold spots would appear in random places. The feeling of being watched became a constant companion. Despite all this, my daughter remained unbothered. She seemed to take comfort in Rose's presence even as the rest of us grew increasingly uneasy. One particularly chilling incident happened on a stormy night. The wind howled outside and rain lashed against the windows. I was in the kitchen when I heard my daughter's laughter coming from the living room. It was late and she should have been asleep. When I walked in to check on her, she was sitting on the floor, her dolls arranged in a circle. She looked up at me and smiled. "Rose is playing with us," she said, motioning to an empty spot across from her. The air in the room felt icy, and I had to suppress a shudder. I gently coaxed her back to bed, but the image of her playing with her friends stayed with me. Another night, I was awoken by a sound so faint I wasn't sure I had heard it at all. It was a soft humming, almost melodic, coming from the direction of my daughter's room. I tiptoed down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. As I approached her door, the humming grew louder. It wasn't my daughter's voice. It was deeper, older, and filled with a sorrow I couldn't explain. I opened the door just a crack and peeked inside. My daughter was fast asleep, but the nest on the floor was different this time. It wasn't empty. The blankets were slightly indented, as if someone invisible was lying there. The humming stopped abruptly, and the room grew eerily silent. I backed away, my hands trembling, and shut the door as quietly as I could. The next morning, I didn't mention what I had seen. I didn't know how to explain it, even to myself. But my daughter seemed unusually cheerful. Rose said she had a good rest last night, she told me with a smile. The following weeks were marked by a growing sense of unease. Shadows seemed to move on their own, and the faint sound of footsteps became a nightly occurrence. One evening, as I was folding laundry in the living room, the television turned on by itself. Static filled the screen, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the corner of the room. When I turned to look, it was gone. Another time, I was in the bathroom when I heard my daughter's voice calling out to me. "Mommy, come play with us," she said, her tone bright and cheerful. I dried my hands and made my way to her room, but when I got there, she was alone. "Who were you talking to?" I asked. She looked at me, puzzled. "Rose," she said simply. "She wanted you to play too." Each incident left me more unsettled than the last, but it wasn't until the final event that I knew we had to take action. It was late at night, and the house was quiet. I was lying in bed when I heard a loud crash coming from the living room. My husband and I rushed downstairs to find the coffee table overturned and the family photo album lying open on the floor. The pages were flipped to a picture of our daughter, her innocent smile beaming up at us. One night, as I was dozing off, I felt a sudden weight press down on the bed beside me. My eyes snapped open, but no one was there. The sensation remained as though someone invisible was sitting beside me. The air turned cold, and I could feel my breath misting in the dim moonlight. I stayed frozen in place until the weight disappeared as suddenly as it had come. The activity in the house became unbearable. Doors slammed shut on their own, and faint whispers echoed through the hallways at night. One evening, as I was cooking dinner, the kitchen lights flickered violently, and a glass flew off the counter, shattering against the wall. My daughter, unfazed, simply looked up from her drawing and said, "Rose is upset." In the days that followed, I consulted a local medium. She walked through the house, her face growing more somber with each step. "There is a presence here," she said finally. "She's not malicious, but she's lost and doesn't realize she's gone." The medium performed a cleansing ritual, and for the first time in months, the house felt lighter. My daughter stopped mentioning Rose, and the nests disappeared. Life returned to normal, though the memories lingered. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that house. Was Rose truly a spirit reaching out for comfort? Or was it all just an elaborate creation of a child's imagination? I may never know the answer, but one thing is certain: some stories are meant to remain a mystery. And some presences, no matter how benevolent they seem, leave an indelible mark that time cannot erase. The first time I heard my mother's voice call out to me when she wasn't even home, I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks. But as the occurrences grew more frequent, the unsettling truth began to creep in. It usually happened in the late afternoons, when the sunlight cast long, eerie shadows across the house. I'd be sitting in the living room, perhaps immersed in a book or playing my N64, when I'd hear her voice calling my name from upstairs. "Your name, can you come here?" It was her voice, clear as day, carrying that same familiar tone she used when she needed something. Every time, my stomach would tighten as I called back, "What is it?" only to be met with silence. On some occasions, I'd go upstairs, cautiously climbing each step, my heart pounding against my ribs. I'd find the second floor eerily quiet. Her room, the bathroom, the guest bedroom, everything was in place, undisturbed. The air always felt heavier up there, pressing down on me, making my skin crawl. When I finally spoke to my mother about it, she looked at me with wide eyes and said, "I've heard you call for me too, when you weren't even home." Her voice carried an edge of fear I'd never heard before. She wasn't imagining it, and neither was I. Then there were the loud bangs from upstairs. Those were harder to ignore. It often happened when I was alone. My mom might be at work or running errands, leaving me home by myself. I'd be in the living room, curled up with a blanket, engrossed in a game. The warm, familiar glow of the TV screen was my only comfort. Then, out of nowhere, boom. It was deafening, like a heavy piece of furniture crashing to the floor. My heart would leap into my throat. I'd pause the game and listen, frozen in place. The silence that followed was even worse. It was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a move. Gathering every ounce of courage, I'd head upstairs to investigate. I'd check every room, expecting to find a dresser tipped over or a chair flung across the floor. But nothing. Everything was perfectly in place. It made no sense. When I told my mom and grandmother about these incidents, they exchanged uneasy glances. My grandmother's face grew pale as she said, "I've heard it too. It's happened to me when I'm alone." The more I thought about these incidents, the more they weighed on me. It was as if the house had a life of its own, a sinister presence lurking in its very foundations. My grandmother later confided that she'd been hearing strange sounds ever since she first moved in. She chalked it up to an old house settling, but deep down, she admitted she always felt watched. One particularly unnerving evening stands out in my memory. It was late, and my mom was working a double shift. I was home alone again, the house blanketed in a quiet so dense it seemed unnatural. As I sat on the couch, I thought I heard soft footsteps upstairs. They were faint at first, almost imperceptible, but they grew louder, more deliberate. My heart started racing. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the creaking of the floorboards or an animal on the roof. But the sound was unmistakably human. Gripping a flashlight, I forced myself to investigate. The upstairs hallway stretched before me like an endless tunnel, the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. The air felt colder up there. Each step forward and acted defiance against the fear clawing at my chest. Room by room, I searched. Everything was as it should be, yet the sensation of being watched grew stronger. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was hiding just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. But the most chilling experience of all happened one night, long after everyone else had gone to bed. It was past midnight, and the house was dark, save for the dim glow of my laptop screen. I was downstairs, seated at the dining table, my back to the open living room. The quiet was comforting at first, a stark contrast to the chaos of the day. I was so focused on whatever I was doing that I didn't notice how the darkness around me had deepened, how the shadows seemed to stretch and shift in unnatural ways. Then, I heard it. At first, it was faint, like a low hum, barely audible over the silence. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I strained to listen. It grew louder, morphing into what sounded like murmuring. It was indistinct, like the hum of a distant crowd. A chill ran down my spine as I realized it was coming from directly behind me. I froze. My body went rigid, every muscle locked in place. The murmuring didn't stop. It ebbed and flowed, like people whispering just out of earshot. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Was it the TV upstairs? The neighbors? But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The sound was too close, too real. My breath hitched as tears welled up in my eyes, not from sadness but from the sheer, paralyzing terror that gripped me. My body's primal response was overwhelming, a physical reaction I couldn't control. I kept my eyes glued to the laptop screen, refusing to turn around. Every instinct screamed at me not to look. The room felt suffocating, the air thick and heavy. Time seemed to stretch, each second an eternity. I could feel the presence behind me, an oppressive weight pressing down on my shoulders. I've never felt so helpless, so small. Eventually, the murmuring faded, the sound dissipating into the stillness of the night. But the fear lingered, wrapping itself around me like a second skin. My body slowly unlocked, and I let out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I couldn't bring myself to move for what felt like hours. When I finally did, I shut the laptop and bolted upstairs to my room, leaving every light on in my path. The next morning, I told my mom about what had happened. Her face went pale as I recounted the experience. When I mentioned the murmuring, her hands trembled slightly. "I've heard it too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's like people talking, but you can't make out the words." Her confession sent a fresh wave of chills down my spine. The house seemed to feed off our fear, growing bolder as time went on. The sounds, the voices, the inexplicable occurrences, they became a part of our lives. We tried to ignore them, to brush them off as figments of our imagination. But deep down, we knew better. Something was there, watching, waiting, lurking just beyond the veil of the ordinary. Months passed, but the occurrences only intensified. There were nights when the air itself seemed alive, thick with whispers and faint rustlings. I started sleeping with the lights on, my nerves perpetually on edge. My mom became more withdrawn, and even my grandmother seemed hesitant to discuss the strange happenings anymore. It was as if acknowledging them gave them power. One evening, my mom and I decided to bring in a family friend who was known for her knowledge of the paranormal. She walked through the house with a solemn expression, pausing in certain areas as if sensing something unseen. When she reached the dining room where I'd heard the murmuring, she stopped and closed her eyes. After a long moment, she whispered, "There's something here. It's old, and it's tied to this place." Her words sent shivers through us. She offered to perform a cleansing ritual, but my mother declined, fearful of what might happen if we disturbed whatever was there. Even now, thinking back to those days, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. The memories cling to me, vivid and unrelenting. That house, it wasn't just a house. It was something else entirely, something that defies explanation. And no matter how much time passes, I know I'll never forget the fear that lived within its walls. The first time I heard my mother's voice call out to me when she wasn't even home, I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks. But as the occurrences grew more frequent, the unsettling truth began to creep in. It usually happened in the late afternoons, when the sunlight cast long, eerie shadows across the house. I'd be sitting in the living room, perhaps immersed in a book or playing my N64, when I'd hear her voice calling my name from upstairs. "Your name, can you come here?" It was her voice, clear as day, carrying that same familiar tone she used when she needed something. Every time, my stomach would tighten as I called back, "What is it?" only to be met with silence. On some occasions, I'd go upstairs, cautiously climbing each step, my heart pounding against my ribs. I'd find the second floor eerily quiet. Her room, the bathroom, the guest bedroom, everything was in place, undisturbed. The air always felt heavier up there, pressing down on me, making my skin crawl. When I finally spoke to my mother about it, she looked at me with wide eyes and said, "I've heard you call for me too, when you weren't even home." Her voice carried an edge of fear I'd never heard before. She wasn't imagining it, and neither was I. The house itself seemed to breathe unease. At night, the shadows would lengthen, and the walls would creak and groan as though something unseen was moving just beyond the veil of perception. One night, as I lay in bed, I woke to the sound of faint whispering. It was muffled, as if coming from behind the walls. My heart raced as I strained to make out the words, but they were incomprehensible, a chorus of murmurs that ebbed and flowed like a sinister chant. I covered my ears and shut my eyes tightly, but the whispers seemed to seep into my mind, echoing in the dark recesses of my thoughts. When I was 10 years old, I often visited a friend who lived around 4 miles away from me. The journey to his house was both exciting and unnerving. To get there, I had to walk alongside a massive cornfield. Its towering stalks seemed to stretch endlessly, rustling ominously in the wind. Only a few houses dotted the roadside, and they were peculiar, always empty, their windows barricaded, and their doors firmly shut as though they were trying to keep something out. Or in. The walk back home was even more unsettling. By then, the sun would begin to set, casting long shadows that danced across the road. The street was eerily quiet, devoid of joggers or dog walkers. It felt as though the world had forgotten about that lonely stretch of road. Each time I passed those abandoned houses, a sense of unease would creep over me, as though unseen eyes were watching my every step. One evening stands out more vividly than any other. I had stayed at my friend's house longer than usual, and dusk had turned into a dark, overcast night by the time I started my journey home. The cool air was thick with the earthy scent of cornfields, and the only sound was the crunch of my sneakers against the gravel path. As I walked, the shadows from the cornfield seemed to stretch toward me, their shapes twisting and contorting like grasping fingers. I was about halfway home when I noticed my shoelace had come loose. I stopped near one of the empty houses to tie it, crouching down and focusing on the simple task to distract myself from the eerie silence. That's when I felt it, a shadow loomed over me, blocking the faint light from the moon. My heart leaped into my throat as an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. I spun around, expecting to see a tree branch or perhaps a trick of the light. But what I saw froze me in place. An old woman stood just inches behind me. Her short black hair framed a face that was twisted into the most sinister smile I had ever seen. Her eyes were dark and hollow, as though they absorbed the light around them, and her smile was impossibly wide, stretching her features into something inhuman. Her thin, bony hand was outstretched, reaching for my shoulder. I didn't think. My instincts took over, and I bolted. My feet pounded against the pavement as I ran faster than I ever thought possible. The adrenaline coursing through my veins drowned out everything, the rustling of the cornfield, the sound of my own gasps for air, even the pounding of my heart. I didn't dare look back until I was several yards away. When I finally mustered the courage to glance over my shoulder, she was still there. She hadn't moved. She just stood in the same spot, her sinister smile still plastered across her face, her empty eyes boring into me. It was as though she knew I would keep running, that she didn't need to chase me. That smile, oh, that smile, was burned into my memory. It was a smile that promised something far worse than I could imagine. As I continued running, the air seemed to grow heavier, each breath becoming a laborious task. The sound of whispers began to follow me, similar to what I had heard in my bedroom. These weren't muffled murmurs anymore, they were distinct, harsh voices that seemed to come from the very shadows. "Don't look back," they hissed, "keep running." I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of my home. My legs burned and my lungs felt like they might burst, but I didn't care. The moment I slammed the door shut behind me, I collapsed onto the floor, tears streaming down my face. My parents rushed to me, alarmed by my state. Between sobs, I told them about the woman, about her smile, about how she had been standing so close to me. Their expressions shifted from concern to confusion as they exchanged uneasy glances. "Nobody lives in those houses," my father said firmly. "They've been empty for years." Despite his reassurances, I couldn't shake the memory of that encounter. Over the years, I walked by those same houses again and again, each time hoping or dreading that I might catch another glimpse of her. But the houses remained as they always were, silent, abandoned, and lifeless. Yet, deep down, I knew she was still there, watching, waiting, hidden behind those boarded windows and locked doors. Even now, 11 years later, I can still feel the weight of her presence when I think about that night. The memory of her smile haunts me, a reminder that some things defy explanation. But it wasn't just her smile that lingers in my memory. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I feel the same oppressive heaviness I felt that evening. I wake up to find my bedroom door slightly ajar, though I always close it before going to bed. Other times, the whispers return, just as they did all those years ago, soft, sinister, and impossible to ignore. There was another incident, years after that encounter, that reaffirmed my fears. I was walking home again, this time in broad daylight, thinking I was safe. As I approached the same stretch of road, I saw movement in one of the windows of the abandoned house. It was faint, like the flutter of a curtain, but there were no curtains in those houses. I stopped in my tracks, staring intently, when a hand appeared, pale, skeletal, and claw-like. It pressed against the glass for a moment before retreating into the darkness. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran as fast as I could, the sound of my pounding heart drowning out everything else. Since that day, I've avoided that road entirely, taking a much longer route whenever I need to travel that way. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that she, or it, is still watching, waiting for the right moment to appear again. Perhaps the most chilling part of all of this is the dream I keep having. It's always the same. I'm standing in front of that house, the one where I saw her. The door is open, and the inside is pitch black, save for a faint, flickering light deep within. I hear the whispers again, calling my name, urging me to step inside. And every time, just as I'm about to cross the threshold, I wake up, drenched in sweat, with the echoes of her laughter ringing in my ears. It was a summer I'll never forget, though I've tried to push it out of my mind countless times. I was 13 years old, and my family had decided to stay at my aunt's house for a few weeks. It was a grand, sprawling place, almost too grand for comfort. My aunt, who was often away for work, lived in this massive 3-story home, complete with a dark, empty basement that was practically its own 2-bedroom apartment. It was the kind of house that seemed alive, every creak and groan of the walls whispering secrets you didn't want to hear. The basement was the stuff of nightmares. The moment you descended the spiral staircase that connected the house's floors, the light would seem to disappear. The basement was a cavern of pitch-black darkness, with no furniture, no decorations, nothing to suggest anyone had ever lived down there. My aunt had always avoided it, claiming she didn't have a reason to go down. But the truth was, even in the daylight, that basement felt like a place where light wasn't welcome. Her house was filled with antique porcelain dolls, each more unnerving than the last. Their painted faces seemed to follow you as you walked through the rooms. Some had cracks running through their delicate features, making them look even more sinister. They lined the shelves, sat in chairs, and stared down from the tops of armoires. It didn't help that the house was always cold, no matter the weather outside. The air carried a damp, almost musty chill that clung to your skin and made your breath hitch when you stepped into certain rooms. One morning, my parents, grandparents, and younger siblings decided to head out for coffee and donuts. My older brother, who was 17, and I opted to stay behind. It felt like a good idea at the time, a chance to explore the massive house without a crowd. My brother went to the living room to relax while I wandered through the ground floor, taking in the strange mix of grandeur and decay that filled the house. The floors creaked beneath my feet, and the old chandeliers swayed slightly as though moved by an invisible hand. After a while, I decided to find my brother. I called out his name, expecting to hear him yell back from another room, but the house answered with silence. I started checking each room on the ground floor, poking my head behind couches and peeking around corners. The stillness of the house began to press on me, a weight that grew heavier with each step. I moved upstairs, checking every bedroom, every closet, and even the bathroom. Still nothing. My calls for him became more frantic, echoing through the halls and coming back to me distorted, as though the house was mocking my desperation. I ran outside, circling the perimeter of the house, yelling his name into the emptiness. The wind picked up, rustling the tall grass around the property and carrying faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. My skin prickled, and I hurried back inside, slamming the heavy door shut behind me. That's when my gaze fell on the spiral staircase that led to the basement. The staircase was wide and ornate, its iron railings curling like the vines of some ancient, otherworldly plant. The darkness at the bottom seemed to pulse, as though it were alive and waiting. My throat tightened as I stood at the top, peering down into the abyss. Gathering what little courage I had left, I started descending, my voice trembling as I called for my brother. The air grew colder with each step, and by the time I reached the bottom, it felt like I had stepped into another world. The pitch blackness swallowed me whole, and I fumbled for a light switch, but my fingers found only cold, damp walls. That's when it hit me, a wave of dread so intense it made my knees buckle. It was as though the darkness itself was pressing against me, suffocating me. The silence was deafening, and yet, beneath it, I could hear something, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming on wood. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The tapping grew louder, closer, and was soon accompanied by a low, guttural hum. It was a sound that didn't belong in this world, a sound that made my blood run cold. I turned toward the stairs, desperate to escape, but as I tried to climb, they seemed to stretch endlessly before me. My steps grew heavier, and the darkness clung to me like a living thing, pulling me back. Just as I thought I'd never make it out, I burst onto the ground floor, gasping for air. My brother was standing there, his face pale and slick with sweat. His eyes widened as he saw me, and he shouted, "Where were you?" His voice was frantic, almost angry. At the same time, I yelled the same question at him, my voice shaking with fear. He told me he'd been sitting on the couch in the living room when he realized he hadn't seen or heard me for a while. He'd started searching the house, calling my name, but there was no sign of me anywhere. He said the house had gone eerily silent, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. When he finally reached the spiral staircase, he saw me running up, my face twisted in terror. But the way he described it sent chills down my spine. He said it didn't look like I was running on my own, it looked like something was chasing me, something just out of sight. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words felt hollow, inadequate. How could I describe the oppressive dread, the impossible darkness, the way the house itself seemed to come alive? My brother and I sat together in the living room, too shaken to move. The porcelain dolls stared down at us, their painted eyes glinting in the dim light. For a moment, I thought I saw one of them blink, but I told myself it was just my imagination. Over the next few days, strange things continued to happen. Doors that had been closed would be wide open when we returned to a room. Objects moved on their own, subtle at first, like a book shifting slightly on a shelf, but then more blatant. One evening, the old record player in the corner of the living room began to play on its own, the needle scratching over the vinyl to produce a haunting, discordant melody. My younger siblings said they heard footsteps at night, heavy and deliberate, pacing outside their bedroom doors. One night, as I was lying in bed, I was jolted awake by a sudden, sharp knocking sound. It came from the ceiling, as if someone was walking on the roof. I lay frozen, listening as the footsteps moved from one side of the house to the other. They weren't hurried, but slow and deliberate, like whoever or whatever it was wanted to make sure I heard them. Then, the knocking stopped, replaced by a soft, eerie laughter that seemed to echo through the walls. The worst incident happened on our last night in the house. Everyone was asleep, or at least trying to be. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The air was thick, suffocating, and the faint sound of whispers began to creep into my ears. They were coming from the direction of the spiral staircase. I got out of bed, driven by some inexplicable need to see what was happening. As I stepped into the hallway, I saw my brother standing at the top of the stairs, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. He turned to me and whispered, "Do you hear it?" Before I could answer, the whispers grew louder, transforming into a cacophony of voices, angry, desperate, pleading. The darkness at the bottom of the stairs began to writhe, forming shapes that were almost human but not quite. Their limbs were too long, their movements too jerky, and their eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light. The dolls on the shelves seemed to respond to the chaos, their heads slowly turning toward the staircase as if acknowledging the entities below. One of them toppled to the floor, shattering into pieces that moved and skittered like insects. My brother and I screamed, running back to my room and slamming the door shut. The voices followed us, pounding against the door like a physical force. My brother grabbed my hand, and we huddled together, too terrified to scream. The pounding continued for what felt like hours, and then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was even more horrifying. When morning finally came, we packed our bags and left the house without looking back. My aunt still lives there, but I've never been back. I don't think I could handle it. Even now, years later, I still have nightmares about that house, about the basement, the dolls, and the darkness that seemed to have a life of its own. I'll never forget the feeling of dread that consumed me, or the way the house seemed to swallow time and space. Some places are just wrong, and that house is one of them. It was a quiet night in 2018 when this happened. I had finished dinner earlier than usual and decided to retreat to my room upstairs. The muffled sounds of my family chatting and laughing downstairs filled the air, giving the house a comforting warmth. But as I climbed the stairs, something shifted. The atmosphere grew still and heavy, like stepping into a forgotten place. I entered my room, which was dimly lit by a faint orange glow from my bedside lamp. Shadows stretched across the walls, their shapes twisting as if alive. I didn't pay much attention. I grabbed my phone and sat on the small couch in the corner of the room. Noticing the battery was low, I leaned down to plug in the charger. The moment the block clicked into the outlet, a cold breeze swept past me, sharp and icy. It wasn't like the cool draft of an open window. It felt deliberate, like something unseen brushing against me. I froze in place, my breath hitching. Then came the sound. A whisper, soft but right next to my ear. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was low, garbled, like someone speaking underwater. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent shivers down my spine. "Haley?" I called out, thinking it was my sister playing a prank. But the room was silent. I quickly glanced toward her room, which was just across the hall. Her door was ajar, but the darkness inside told me it was empty. A deep, unsettling realization hit me. I was completely alone upstairs. My heart pounded as I tried to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was nothing. But deep down, I knew better. Panic took over, and I bolted for the stairs, nearly tripping in my haste. When I reached the living room, I found my entire family sitting there, unaware of the strange events unfolding just above them. "What's wrong?" my mom asked, her concerned gaze locking onto mine. I hesitated. I thought I heard something upstairs. My dad shrugged, barely looking up from his phone. "Old houses make noises. Probably just the wind or the pipes." But it wasn't the wind. It wasn't the pipes. I didn't say anything else, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone up there. That night, as I lay in bed, the eerie sensation lingered. Every creak of the house sounded louder than it should. The shadows in my room seemed darker, deeper. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off to sleep. But the dreams that came were anything but restful. In my dream, I was in my room, but it wasn't my room. It was darker, colder, and filled with a suffocating sense of dread. The shadows on the walls moved unnaturally, slithering and stretching as if they had minds of their own. And then I saw it, a figure standing in the corner. It was tall, impossibly dark, and featureless. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. Over the next few days, strange things continued to happen. Objects in my room seemed to shift positions when I wasn't looking. My phone would randomly light up in the middle of the night, its screen glowing eerily in the darkness. The whispers returned, faint at first, but always close to my ear. They grew louder, more insistent, like someone was trying to tell me something I didn't want to hear. One evening, as I sat on my bed reading, the whispers became overwhelming. They seemed to echo from every corner of the room. I covered my ears, but the sound seeped through, chilling and relentless. Suddenly, my lamp flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The air turned cold, almost suffocating, and I could feel the presence of something or someone watching me. I grabbed my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the familiar shapes of my furniture. But then, in the corner of the room, near the closet, the light caught something else. A figure. It was the same shadowy form from my dream, tall, featureless, and completely still. My breath caught in my throat as terror rooted me in place. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, as if it were drawing the very air from the room. Finally, I screamed, breaking the oppressive silence. The figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving no trace behind. My family rushed upstairs, their faces filled with alarm. "What happened?" my mom asked, grabbing my shoulders. "There was something in my room," I stammered. "I saw it. It was right there." They searched the room, turning on the lights and checking every corner, but found nothing. My dad tried to reassure me, saying it was probably a trick of the light or my imagination. But I knew what I had seen. That night, I refused to sleep in my room. I camped out on the couch in the living room, the warm glow of the TV my only comfort. The events didn't stop, though. One night, as I lay on the couch, I felt a hand tap my shoulder. I turned quickly, expecting to see my mom or dad, but no one was there. The living room was silent, the house still. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again, the shadowy figure, this time at the base of the stairs. It didn't move, but stood there, watching me. Its presence was overwhelming, filling the room with a bone-deep cold. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure slowly turned and ascended the stairs, its movements impossibly smooth. When it reached the top, it vanished into the darkness. The next morning, I told my family everything. My mom listened quietly, her face pale. "I've felt it too," she admitted. "Sometimes, when I'm alone, it feels like someone's standing right behind me." We brought in a family friend who had experience with cleansing houses. She burned sage and recited prayers, moving from room to room. The house felt lighter afterward, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't truly gone. Even now, years later, I still feel that icy breeze sometimes. The whispers are gone, but the sensation in my ear remains, a reminder of the night something unknown brushed against the thin veil of our reality. And on quiet nights, when the house is still, I wonder if it's waiting, just out of sight, watching and listening.